research confirms that Americans bought the ideas and innovations of the sexual revolution not because of convincing arguments, but because of lost moral authority. For the Colson Center, I'm John Stonestreet. This is Breakpoint. Hey, anyone else dizzy by how quickly some things have gone from being unthinkable to unquestionable just in the last few years? Although the most recent demands of the sexual revolution are more radical than ever, people seem to be more quickly embracing them than ever. For example, when Andrew Sullivan first made the case for same-sex marriage in the New Republic all the way back in 1989, the very notion was considered to be beyond the fringe, and it stayed that way for about 2 decades. But then suddenly, it wasn't beyond the fringe anymore. By 2012, a majority of Americans favored same-sex marriage. 3 years later, it became a constitutional right. Today, opposition or even ambivalence to same-sex marriage is regarded as being beyond the fringe. And the pace of change on sexual issues has only accelerated. Transgenderism was considered beyond the fringe when same-sex marriage was legalized. And I predict the acceptance of polyamory could happen even faster. So what explains this quick and thorough collapse of the old moral consensus? Well, that's what I talk about on the Breakpoint podcast this week with sociologist Mark Regnerus of the University of Texas. Our conversation dug into a recent public discourse article that he wrote, How the Rise in Unreligious Americans Affects Sex and Marriage, Comparative Evidence from New Survey Data. Just after the midterm elections in November 2018, Mark Regnerus asked 3 groups, Catholics, evangelical Protestants, and the non-religious, about their opinions relating to marriage, family, and sexuality. He compared those responses with responses from a survey he conducted 3 years prior. What Regnerus found was that the non-religious are now even more likely to hold progressive views on marriage, family, and sexuality, especially when compared to self-identified Catholics and evangelicals. For instance, 24% of the non-religious agreed with the statement, marriage is outdated, compared to just 10% of Catholics and 2% of evangelicals. Similarly, the non-religious were 3 times more likely to say polyamorous relations are okay compared to Catholics and 10 times more likely compared to evangelicals. And the non-religious were 8 times as likely as evangelicals to say sometimes extramarital sex can be okay. Now, of course, the strong relationship between one's religious observances and their view on marriage, family, and sex is no surprise. But what makes Regnerus' study so revealing is how rapidly the number of those who self-identify as non-religious has increased. In 2015, they made up just 15% of respondents. 4 years later, they made up 20%. That's a 1/3 increase in just 3 years. The non-religious are often called the nones, and it's important to remember that relatively few of them are atheists or agnostics. Many believe in things like astrology and witchcraft, and many consider themselves to be quite spiritual. But they reject authoritative religious traditions and institutions, and increasingly, they embrace progressive views on social issues. But the even more ominous trend from this study is that even though there exists a significant disparity in views between the religious and non-religious, the religious are displaying trends of increasing liberalization too. Catholics have witnessed liberalization in attitudes, Mark says, though evangelical numbers display a more modest uptick. Regnerus concludes that Christians seem to be growing more complicit in the sexual revolution, or at least more quiet about their misgivings year upon year. Don't miss this important discussion with Mark Regnerus on the Breakpoint podcast. You can find it at breakpoint.org or wherever you subscribe to podcasts. It's a conversation that will help you prepare when that next previously unthinkable thing becomes conventional wisdom, which, at the rate we're going, could be next week. For Breakpoint, I'm John Stonestreet.